Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.22 and in this lesson we're going to take a listen to my final creation. So in the last video we went over the rules and parameters for this creation assignment, and now I went ahead and made something within those rules and guidelines. First things first, I would encourage you to turn your speakers up or turn your headphones up just a little bit. There's a lot of change happening in this composition, and it's very subtle. It's very much an experimental composition in that things don't really evolve or change too much. There's not really distinct sections to this track, but there are subtle changes and subtle modulations all the way through. And don't ever forget that even the most subtle of change can make a huge difference in a composition. We talked about this in, I think, the video on timbre, and I explained how if you pluck a guitar in real life and you record that, and you pluck it again, you record your live performance, each and every one of those plucks is always a little bit different. It's impossible for you to get your finger in exactly the same place and, pluck it with the exact same intensity, with the exact same strength, and evoke the same sound. There are so many factors that could impact that sound. With recorded medium, once you record something, you can loop it indefinitely and it actually is the exact same sound. That's the big difference between like acoustic music and digital music here. And one of the things that producers always seem to forget is that in the real world, you can't evoke the exact same sound twice. It's just impossible. It will never happen. So they'll throw on like an 808 kick and just keep repeating that exact same kick drum again and again and again. Well, after the 15th iteration of that, I'm kind of bored and my ear has realized that this isn't natural. This is the exact same thing. So evoking subtle modulations, subtle changes is huge. And I've tried to do that throughout this piece, even with my loop that's pretty much untouched. This is like this really deep sub-bassy type of sound. I was constantly changing the volume. And by constantly changing the volume, it at least adds something. And I kind of did that because at one point I was thinking I'm going to put a delay device on here. I'll put the delay time down super low and maybe play with the offset and play with that time. But upon trying that out, it just didn't work. It sounded terrible. So I scrapped that idea and just kind of left that as is. Everything else has a delay device on it. And sometimes that delay is being used very subtly. At other times, it's really kind of blatant and even maybe a little bit cliche. I think with the strum sound here, I was pretty cliche with the delay, so it kind of delays and then you hear it at a quarter note, and it kind of repeats like that. But there's nothing wrong with using a device for its default purpose. That's totally okay. And with that track that I played you guys before, who was that? Was that Ciara or somebody? We played it and we listened to the beginning and you could hear that delay. That was very much a traditional standard use of the delay. I went a little crazy here and I did some other things. I think on one of these tracks, I have two delays going back to back. And so one of them is evoking more of a timbral type change with a low millisecond here. It's so low that you can't actually hear two distinct signals. It just blends together like one. And then I used another delay, a little bit more traditional sense, bouncing that new sound off and creating repetitions of it, clear, distinct repetitions. But if you can go through and just look at all of the things that I've made here, there's a lot of blue dots, which means there's a lot of automation going on. For better or for worse, who knows? But for the most part, I was just trying to evoke change throughout this composition. The interesting thing is when I started this, I made my track and I did it without using any pan or any delay. So if we go back through here, we see there's no devices. Listening back after the fact to these two tracks, the one with delay and the one without, I was kind of stuck. I kind of felt like, oh, there are parts about this first one that I really like, and there's parts about this second one that I really like. And it feels like with this delay track, those delays are taking away some of the really unique qualities to this first track. But you know what? That's totally okay, and that's going to happen. Each and every track that you make, whether you like it or you hate it, it's going to be different. And those differences and those varieties are what are going to entice a wide number of listeners to your work or to your music. So just because I might prefer the first version to the second one doesn't mean the next guy who listens to it is going to feel the same way. And that's one of the really beautiful things about music. So let's take a listen to my creation project, and then we'll pretty much wrap things up for this video. I wanted to start by just playing you guys the few samples that I started with. So why don't we go into the original project here, turn this on, go over to the mix view, and we can listen to my original samples. Here they are in their glory. Yep, that's really interesting. Obviously, when we have access to a jaw harp, I'm going to use it all the time. And so I used it in this composition. And then last but not least, the real star of the show. I actually did something really interesting with this particular sample, which maybe some of you will be interested in seeing. I went in here and I noticed that there was still content at the very end of this sample. It's just, you couldn't really hear it. So if I go to the start point and click play on this, you can hear there's a little bit of content going on there. And so what I did was I zoomed in towards the very end of this sample, and actually when it was brought in, it was at like -10 and it was not really audible. I went towards the very end here and I just grabbed a little loop. And from that loop, I amplified it a few times and I went back and took a listen to it. And here's ultimately what I got. I'm gonna have to pull this way up so you can hear it. Now that to me sounds like a really good like vinyl type crackle sound, vinyl type loop. And people will search out all over the place trying to find nice clean vinyl sounds, which I guess I should say they're looking for dirty vinyl sounds that they can throw into their composition to give it a little bit more of a vintage vinyl-y feel. And it was crazy because just by going in and pulling up the volume on that little snippet there, I had a pretty good vinyl sound, and it's something I could use again. And not only that, this is something that nobody else is going to have access to. I don't think too many people are going through the Bitwig samples and finding these little moments to then bring up and amplify, which I did. So I thought that was one of my favorite things about this whole track, was that I was able to evoke this really sort of natural vinyl sound just by amplifying a tiny little snippet of a sample that I kind of picked at random. So that sidebar over, let's listen to this track in its entirety. Again, I would encourage you guys to turn up the volume just a little bit because there's a lot of subtle nuance that's occurring here. And if you don't have the volume up, you're not going to hear it. So this is a composition that definitely requires some active listening. I've thrown a limiter on here as well. Put the settings in so that it's not actually doing any gain reduction, but it's at least bringing the volume up a little bit. Here we go. So, although that may just sound like a bunch of random noise and samples, that took a really long time. And that came from just those three samples that we started with. Is this my favorite composition of all time? No, absolutely not. But I'm happy that I went through. I'm happy that I completed it. Even when I was working on it, I wasn't very happy with it, but I kind of just stuck my head down, went through it. And honestly, on going back and listening to it and listening to it at different levels, it's really quite an interesting track and something that you'd have to listen to a number of times to really try to pick up on all of those changes, all of those variations to the samples. When I look back on this and kind of the assignment I gave you, I probably made a little bit of a mistake. And I think after making this, I spent so much time working with the samples and coming up with my arrangement here, and I was really happy with it at this stage without even touching a delay device. What I really probably should have done is just said, use one tone, use that tone generator, pop something out at like 440 or 500, and just use a delay device and see what you can come up with. That would have forced you to really use that delay in a lot of unconventional and interesting ways. But instead, I decided to kind of continue us on a track that we've been going down where you could pick a few samples, make variations, and then throw the delay device in there. And honestly, I wasn't able to use it to its fullest potential because there were a lot of times where I wanted to do something really creative and interesting with it, and it just didn't fit. It didn't work. So I had to either strip it back and go a little bit more subtle or used in kind of a traditional way. I'm not really happy about having to use it the way I used it on that strum track, but honestly, I couldn't think of anything else at the time. I also never really got into using the delay device and then bouncing it and reversing it. For some reason, that just never crossed my mind at the time. But of course, you can do that as well. So don't be afraid to bounce things out. Delay something, bounce it, delay it in a new way, bounce it again, keep delaying it, keep bouncing it, and see what you can come up with. You'd be surprised. You can do some pretty radical stuff with that tiny little delay device. So that's going to do it for this particular lesson. I will upload this to SoundCloud at some point. So if you want to take a listen to it without the YouTube compression, you can do so there. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to share whatever you have, and I will catch you again in the next lesson.